Picture a colossal cargo vessel cutting through Arctic ice, its hull stacked high with consumer electronics bound for Europe. 5 years ago, this route was considered impossible for commercial shipping. Today, it's reality. The captain isn't Western, he's Chinese. And instead of steering toward the Suez Canal, the artery that powered Western trade dominance for generations, he is moving north through frozen waters controlled by Russia. This detour saves nearly 2 weeks of travel and thousands of miles. Now imagine this scene not as a rare exception, but as a routine occurrence repeated more than 100 times in a single year. This is the world of 2025, where global trade routes are being redrawn in ice, and the West is watching its grip loosen in real time. For over a century and a half, Western powers shaped global commerce by dominating maritime chokepoints. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, it became one of the most strategic waterways on Earth, channeling roughly 12% of global maritime trade between Asia and Europe. Control the canal, and you controlled the flow of goods, energy, and economic power, but that era is slipping away fast. Current shipping data tells a story that policymakers in Washington and Brussels can't ignore. Container traffic through the Suez Canal has collapsed by approximately 86% compared to 2023. This isn't a temporary slowdown or market correction. It's a near total evaporation of traffic from one of history's most vital trade corridors. As Western shipping firms watched Suez empty out, Moscow and Beijing quietly began operating an alternative system, one far from NATO patrols, sanctions pressure, or Western leverage. At the center of the shift is the Northern Sea Route, a 5,600-kilometer passage tracing Russia's Arctic coastline from the Barents Sea to the Bering Strait. For centuries, this route was locked under thick ice, written off as a frozen dead end. Today, climate change has done what technology and ambition alone could not. Seasonal ice retreat has opened a pathway that fundamentally alters global logistics. Russia, armed with the world's only fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers, now controls access to this shortcut. The numbers explain why it matters. Shipping goods from Shanghai to Rotterdam through Suez requires a journey of around 13,000 miles. Using the Arctic route cuts the distance down to roughly 8,000 miles. That's up to 15 days saved per voyage, dramatically lower fuel consumption, and millions of dollars in cost reductions. But this transformation isn't just economic, it's strategic. Whoever controls the fastest routes controls influence in global trade. The scale of this shift becomes undeniable when you look at the data. In 2024, cargo transported along the Northern Sea Route reached a record 37.9 million tons. That figure includes Russia's internal Arctic traffic, but the real signal lies in international transit shipping. In 2025 alone, 103 transit voyages moved over 3 million tons of cargo directly through Arctic waters. Container traffic surged. Chinese companies doubled their Arctic container voyages compared to 2 years earlier. Container volumes jumped to 400,000 tons, more than 2.5 times higher than in 2024. This is no longer trial and error experimentation. These are scheduled commercial services. Chinese firms like Nunu Shipping and Sea Legend now operate regular Arctic routes linking Shanghai to major European ports. One ship, the Istanbul Bridge, completed the first direct container journey between China and the United Kingdom via the Arctic in just 20 days, maintaining high speeds despite the harsh environment. Compare that to the 40-day journey around Africa. Buoyant's Cape of Good Hope, a detour ships have been forced to take since instability in the Red Sea turned the Suez approach into a high-risk zone. And this is where alarm bells are ringing across Western capitals. The Arctic route isn't an isolated development, and China isn't Russia's only partner. A second strategic corridor is emerging further south, and it runs through Iran. The International North-South Transport Corridor is a 7,200-kilometer network linking India to Russia via Iran, the Caspian Sea. In late 2025, Russia, Iran, and Azerbaijan finalized agreements that removed one of the corridor's biggest obstacles, unpredictable transit costs. Fixed tariffs were introduced, making the route commercially viable for large-scale freight forwarding. Shortly after, Moscow and Tehran agreed to form the first joint container shipping consortium in the Caspian Sea, with operations connecting Iran, India, and China set to launch in 2026. Russia also ratified agreements granting India access to Arctic shipping and dozens of Russian military and logistical bases stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Pacific. When you connect these developments, a clear pattern emerges. Russia and China are shaping Arctic trade. Russia and Iran are securing the Caspian corridor. India is being integrated into both systems. These aren't random partnerships or isolated projects. They form a coordinated alternative trade architecture designed to bypass Western-controlled routes entirely. No Suez, no reliance on NATO-policed waters, no single choke point that can be closed under political pressure. The objective is straightforward and ruthless: render Western dominance over global shipping obsolete. And the results speak for themselves. As these new corridors expanded, traffic through the Suez Canal continued to crater. Throughout 2025, container ship counts hovered near historic lows, with some weeks seeing fewer than 30 container vessels where hundreds once passed. The broader impact is visible in global shipping metrics. The United Nations Trade and Development Connectivity Index fell sharply from over 550 points in late 2023 to just above 413 by the third quarter of 2025. That drop doesn't tease was an signal of temporary disruption. It marks a structural fracture in the global trade system that emerged after World War II, a system designed, dominated, and enforced by the West. Now it is time to confront the uncomfortable truth Western governments would rather avoid. Sanctions didn't eat tea work, but not for the reasons people were promised. The economic pressure campaign against Russia after the Ukraine war was meant to choke Moscow's trade, isolate its economy, and force political collapse through financial pain. Instead, it triggered the exact opposite outcome. Locked out of Western shipping services, denied Western insurance, and restricted from Western ports, Russia responded the way every isolated power throughout history has responded. It stopped trying to fit into the existing system and began building a new one. And it didn't do it alone. China, Iran, India, and other states saw opportunity where the West saw punishment. By 2025, the scale of this shift became impossible to ignore. More than 100 sanctioned vessels were operating along the Northern Sea route, compared to just 13 the year before. This wasn't normal commercial traffic. It was the rise of a shadow fleet, aging tankers sailing under flags of convenience, operating outside Western regulatory systems, moving Russian oil and gas eastward despite sanctions. Dozens of these ships were oil tankers, along with LNG carriers, many over 15 years old, some lacking proper ice class certification, all navigating one of the most hazardous maritime environments on the planet. As scrutiny increased, Russia's Northern Sea Route Administration quietly reduced the transparency of its reporting, limiting public access to detailed ship movement data and making independent monitoring far more difficult. But here's the paradox that Western policymakers didn't anticipate. The growth of this shadow fleet actually reinforces Russia. Bang, strategic argument. Sanctions were supposed to suffocate Arctic development. Instead, they created a lawless frontier where Western competitors simply don't operate. Major global carriers have stepped aside entirely. Mediterranean Shipping Company publicly reaffirmed in late 2025 that it would avoid Arctic routes, citing environmental risks and safety concerns. European giants like Maritime, Tehran, and onward to India in just over 3 weeks, significantly faster and cheaper than traditional maritime routes. For goods where margins matter more than speed, these savings are transformative. What's emerging goes far beyond logistics efficiency. This is the construction of a Eurasian trade system that bypasses Western influence entirely. No Mediterranean transit, no dependence on NATO-patrolled waters, no reliance on Western insurers, shipping firms, banks, or political approval. Russia anchors the north with Arctic access. Iran bridges the Middle East and the Caspian. China supplies manufacturing scale and shipping volume. India provides the southern endpoint and massive consumer demand. Together, they reassembling a parallel trade network engineered from the ground up to be resilient against sanctions and external pressure. Every shipment that flows through these routes, instead of traditional Western-controlled corridors, represents lost revenue, lost leverage, and lost influence for the old system. And there's a sharp irony underlying it all. The environmental changes making Arctic navigation possible are the legacy of centuries of Western industrialization. The sanctions accelerating Russia's pivot were imposed by Western governments. The environmental activism discouraging Western firms from Arctic competition is rooted largely in Western societies. Moscow and Beijing didn't create these conditions. They simply recognized them faster and acted without hesitation. Strategically, it resembles a classic miscalculation, sacrificing immediate advantage in pursuit of moral or tactical victory, only to realize too late that the board itself has shifted. The West gave up its seat at the table of Arctic commerce. Russia and China didn't hesitate. They sat down and started dealing the cards. Now we need to confront the most dangerous consequence of all, the shadow fleet. This is where the situation stops being abstract geopolitics and starts becoming a real-world hazard, and it exposes a fundamental flaw in the Western strategy. By 2025, roughly one-third of all traffic moving along the northern sea route involved sanctioned vessels. These ships are often old, poorly maintained tankers operating without proper ice-class certification. They regularly change flags, sometimes shut off tracking systems, carry questionable insurance, and operate with minimal oversight in one of the harshest maritime environments on the planet. Environmental organizations are deeply alarmed, and with good reason. An oil spill in Arctic waters wouldn't just be serious, it would be catastrophic. The region lacks meaningful spill response infrastructure. Search and rescue capacity is limited. Ice, darkness, and extreme weather would make cleanup operations nearly impossible. Groups monitoring Arctic shipping warn that the issue isn't whether an accident will happen, but when. Several maritime safety experts argue that, under current conditions, a major environmental disaster is effectively inevitable. This leads directly to the central contradiction in the Western approach. Sanctions pushed Russian oil and gas exports into gray market channels. At the same time, Western environmental and regulatory pressures discouraged legitimate shipping companies from operating in the Arctic at all. The result is the worst possible outcome. Russian exports continue, but now they move on riskier ships with weaker safety standards and far greater environmental danger than if they were transported by regulated commercial carriers. Russia's response has been to close the curtain. For years, the Northern Sea Route Administration published detailed data on every ship approved to transit Arctic waters, including violations and incidents. That transparency vanished. In October 2025, public ship tracking services were shut down and access to other online systems was restricted. Many sanctioned vessels using the route simply stopped appearing in official records. The message was unmistakable. If access to the global shipping system is denied, operations will continue outside it, and without disclosure, and there is very little the West can do to intervene. These waters fall under Russian jurisdiction. Western navies cannot patrol them. Western regulators cannot inspect vessels. Western insurers cannot enforce standards. Sanctions stop at the edge of sovereignty, and Russia has built a natural moat of ice and law around this corridor. While safety risks grow in the Arctic, the economic consequences elsewhere are becoming increasingly painful. Countries dependent on traditional routes are paying the price. Egypt, whose economy relies heavily on Suez Canal revenue, has been hit hard. Transit income showed slight increases only because tolls were raised aggressively to offset collapsing volume. But price hikes cannot compensate for an 86% drop in traffic. In mid-2025, Egypt even offered fee discounts to large container ships in a bid to lure traffic back. Most carriers declined, choosing predictability and safety over marginal cost savings. Meanwhile, shipping costs surged. Freight rates between East Asia and Europe climbed dramatically between 2023 and 2025. Not because shipping companies were raking in profits, but because longer routes around Africa require more ships, more fuel, more crew time, and more capital tied up in transit. Those costs ripple outward. Consumer goods become more expensive. Industrial inputs cost more. Inflation pressure builds, not due to tariffs or factory shutdowns, but because the geometry of global shipping itself has shifted. Some analysts insist this disruption is temporary. They argue that once regional conflicts subside and security returns to traditional routes, everything will snap back to normal. The evidence doesn't support that optimism. By late 2025, regional ceasefires were in place. Attacks on commercial shipping declined sharply. War risk insurance premiums fell to near pre-crisis levels. Conditions improved, but traffic did not return in force. In fact, Suez container volumes in late 2025 remained lower than the previous year. A handful of major carriers cautiously resumed limited transits, but these were test runs, not a full-scale revival. The reason is simple. During the years when Suez was unreliable, supply chains adapted. Companies learned they could function without it. New routes were tested. Contracts were rewritten. Infrastructure investments were made. And some of those alternatives proved competitive even without crisis conditions. The Arctic route offers meaningful savings for certain cargo categories where time and fuel efficiency outweigh seasonal complexity. The North-South corridor provides connectivity between India, Iran, Russia, and beyond, entirely outside Western-controlled choke points. Once those systems exist, they don't vanish when the old route becomes safe again. They remain in place, competing for cargo and market share. Trade geography has momentum. Changing routes is expensive, but reversing course is just as costly. There's another factor pushing this shift forward: long-term economic gravity. Global growth is increasingly centered in Asia. China, India, and Southeast Asia represent expanding markets with rising demand. Europe, by contrast, faces demographic aging and slower growth. A shipping system optimized for Europe made sense in the 20th century. In the 21st, the most valuable trade flows are increasingly Asia to Asia and Asia to Eurasia. The emerging corridors reflect that reality. The North-South route directly serves India-China-Russia trade. The Arctic route supports both China-Europe trade and the rapidly expanding Russia-China energy relationship. Energy infrastructure between the two countries continues to scale, requiring supporting logistics that align naturally with Arctic shipping lanes. Taken together, these trends suggest something deeper than a temporary disruption. They point to a lasting reconfiguration of global trade routes, one driven not by ideology, but by economics, geography, and adaptation under pressure. Once these systems mature, they don't disappear. They become part of the new normal. Russia and China are no longer just partners of convenience in shipping. What's unfolding is far broader and far more deliberate. Their coordination now spans energy, infrastructure, technology, and military power. In late 2025, both governments approved a formal action plan to expand cargo movements along the Northern Sea route. This wasn't negotiated by private companies. On the Russian side, the process is overseen by Rosatom, a state nuclear corporation. On the Chinese side, it's led by the Minister of Transport. That alone tells you everything you need to know. This is not market-driven cooperation. It's state-directed strategy. Commercial expansion is unfolding in parallel with military signaling. Joint naval drills in Arctic waters, coordinated Coast Guard patrols, regular long-range bomber flights near Alaska. These actions mirror the growth of Arctic shipping, reinforcing control while testing Western responses. China openly refers to itself as a near-Arctic state. Geographically, that claim makes little sense. Strategically, it makes perfect sense. Beijing is signaling that it has interests in the Arctic, intends to defend those interests, and is working with Russia because Moscow controls physical access while China supplies the industrial scale and shipping volume needed to make Arctic routes economically viable. One side provides geography, the other provides demand. Together, they form a powerful alignment. Iran's calculations follow a similar logic. For Tehran, the international north-south transport corridor represents something invaluable: economic connectivity that cannot be vetoed by Western capitals. Decades of sanctions have forced Iran to operate in isolation, but isolation is expensive. Acting as a transit hub between Russia and India changes that equation. Ports, railways, trucking networks, and logistics services generate revenue and employment that sanctions can't easily disrupt. Trade targets between Russia and Iran now exceed $5 billion, and the corridor provides the physical backbone to move that commerce. India benefits as well. The corridor gives New Delhi flexibility, access to Russian trade without full dependence on Western approval, quicker links to Central Asia, and optional access to Iranian energy resources. India has already demonstrated its appetite for alternative routes. The Chennai-Vladivostok Eastern Maritime Corridor, operational since 2024, cuts transit times nearly in half compared to traditional routes via Suez. Plans are underway to expand this concept to additional ports and regional trade lanes. None of these developments exist in isolation. They are components of a larger transformation, the creation of a Eurasian economic system that functions independently of Western-controlled logistics, finance, and maritime choke points. Some describe it as a modern Silk Road. Others frame it as Eurasian integration. Labels aside, the reality is undeniable. Trade volumes worth trillions of dollars are being redirected through infrastructure that barely existed 10 years ago, built and controlled by countries the West has tried to constrain. The pace of change is accelerating. Container traffic along the Northern Sea route more than doubled between 2023 and 2025. That isn't T, steady growth, it's S, rapid adoption. Rosatom reported a surge in vessel applications for the 2025 navigation season, with nearly 200 ships seeking Arctic transit permits by late spring. Many were foreign flagged and directly linked to Sino-Russian trade. Momentum is building, and momentum matters. By contrast, the Western response has been slow and fragmented. The United States has begun expanding the Port of Nome in Alaska to support Arctic access, but this effort lags far behind Russia's decades-long investment in icebreakers and Arctic infrastructure. Canada continues Arctic research missions, but has made limited progress toward developing commercial shipping capacity through its northern waters. European nations, constrained by environmental policy and sanctions compliance, have largely withdrawn from Arctic commercial competition altogether. There is no shortage of rhetoric. Calls to monitor Russian activity, counter Chinese influence, strengthen NATO's northern posture. What's missing is a serious commercial strategy. Sanctions do not create shipping lanes. Moral arguments do not build icebreakers. Market share is won with ports, vessels, logistics networks, and long-term investment. Russia and China are building those assets. The West largely is not, which leads to the core question: can this shift be reversed, or is it becoming permanent? The answer depends on decisions made soon, but the window is narrowing. Reversing course would require multiple breakthroughs at once: full security restoration in the Red Sea, a sustainable solution to Middle Eastern instability, a way to compete in Arctic shipping without violating sanctions or environmental commitments, credible alternatives to the North-South corridor for countries like India and Iran, and somehow slowing China's demand for faster, cheaper Eurasian trade routes. None of these conditions appear close to being met. Meanwhile, every successful Arctic shipping season strengthens the route. Operational experience accumulates, risks feel more manageable, infrastructure investment becomes easier to justify, what was once experimental becomes routine. Even during the difficult 2025 season, when open water windows were short and ice conditions challenging, traffic still increased. As warming trends continue, navigability improves. Russia is already constructing icebreakers designed to extend the shipping season, with the long-term goal of year-round Arctic navigation for ice-capable vessels. Once that threshold is crossed, the Northern Sea Route stops being an alternative and becomes a permanent competitor to Suez. At that point, the shift is no longer reversible. The environmental irony is stark. Climate change enables Arctic shipping, yet Arctic shipping accelerates climate change through emissions, ecosystem disruption, and expanded fossil fuel logistics. It's a self-reinforcing loop, but no single actor has an incentive to stop. Russia gains leverage and revenue. China gains efficiency and independence. Cargo owners save time and money. The environmental costs are spread across the planet and pushed into the future, borne by ecosystems and communities with no voice in the decision-making process. This is the tragedy of the commons unfolding slowly across a melting ocean. And the one group with both the technological capability and stated environmental commitment to intervene, the West, has largely stepped aside, constrained by sanctions, politics, and moral positioning. The game continues, not because it's sustainable, but because it's profitable, strategic, and already in motion. So where does this story lead? The likely outcome isn't a restoration of Western shipping dominance. Instead, we are heading toward a bifurcated system. Western-aligned trade continues along traditional routes, governed by strict environmental standards, heavy regulation, and relatively lower volume. Meanwhile, a growing Eurasian network flows through the Arctic and Central Asian corridors. Less regulated, higher risk, and rapidly expanding. Over time, the economic and geopolitical center of gravity shifts eastward. The Arctic effectively becomes a Chinese, Russian-controlled commercial domain, even if legal sovereignty remains Russian. Middle powers like India and Iran gain leverage by straddling both systems, while Egypt and the Suez Canal become secondary, much like the Panama Canal, still important for certain shipments, but no longer the indispensable choke point it once was. Western Europe, historically central to global commerce, gradually becomes peripheral, a market to serve rather than the hub it used to be. The Mediterranean returns to its historical role as a regional sea rather than a global crossroads. This isn't the end of Western influence, but it is the end of the West's era of shipping dominance, the kind that has persisted since the 19th century. That dominance relied on controlling choke points: Suez, Panama, Malacca, Bab el-Mandeb. Today, climate change is physically opening new pathways. Geopolitical competition is driving massive investment to develop those routes. And Western strategic decisions, sanctions, environmental constraints, risk aversion, are preventing its companies and governments from competing effectively in this new geography. Future historians may well look back at the mid-2020s as a turning point, the moment when the global shipping map fundamentally changed, and the 20th century architecture of trade gave way to something more multipolar, more Eurasian, and less Western-controlled. The ships breaking through Arctic ice today are doing more than moving cargo, they are moving history. Economic power doesn't shift overnight, as military power or political authority might. Instead, it shifts slowly, transaction by transaction, each delivery, each shipment a small vote for a new system. By the time the scale of the change becomes widely acknowledged, the infrastructure is in place, the networks are established, and the expertise is accumulated. The new normal has become normal, and right now we are witnessing that transition unfold in real time. The Suez Canal, once a monument to 19th century engineering and Western imperial ambition, is increasingly bypassed by routes that barely existed a generation ago, routes controlled by nations the West spent decades trying to contain. The Arctic and Central Asian corridors, Russia and Iran's infrastructure, China's shipping might, India's rising demand, aren't just alternatives to the old system. They are the future, being built one voyage at a time through ice and defiance while the West watches, morally certain, strategically paralyzed, and economically outmaneuvered.